All right, Charon, Zoom, you hear me all right? Excellent. Jeremy Lassen, our first Zoom listener from Spain. Mamish. All right. All right, Shabbos, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Today's daf is, let's begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the Shimon Drushos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah and Sarah bas Avram. And to thank Avram and Shindi Kalman for dedicating all the Shimon Drushos this month in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina bas Yoshua Heschel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in Nechama. I will say today's daf is daf Zayin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. We are starting on Vav Amud Beis. And we went ahead and left off, good. Ba'ola Edim, kind of like smack in the middle of this last brisa, which I apologize about. I just ran out of time yesterday, which is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. Ba'ola Edim. So as I remember again, just to reframe a little bit, we were speaking about the fundamental machlokes Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef regarding the concept of Rav Sheshes said that if there are Eidim anywhere in the world who know about her guilt, they will ultimately go ahead and essentially prevent the Sotah process from occurring. So that was Rav Sheshes. Rav Yosef was very bothered by that, as were many other opinions, because if you do that, you end up casting aspersion on the entire Sotah process. Why? Because essentially what's going to end up happening is a woman's going to drink the waters, she's going to emerge unscathed, which should be a testament to her innocence. But yet, what are people going to say? She's not innocent. Rather what? There are witnesses somewhere. Or again, as the Gemara already pointed out, and we'll talk about this more in depth in days to come, if you hold to the concept of schus tolela, the idea that somehow some merit could kind of delay the effects of the water, you could run into that same issue as well, because now a woman's going to go ahead and drink the water and nothing's going to happen. It does suddenly, again, it doesn't automatically or immediately attest to her innocence. It can mean a variety of different things. So the Gemara says that's what we're clearing now. So Ba'ala Idim Shi Tmeya. So let's say again, she's already immersed in the Sotah process, and witnesses come and they say that she is Tmeya. So what's Talacha? Minchasa Nisrefes. Her mincha ultimately again will be burned. We don't offer. So if they go ahead and the witnesses show up before mincha is offered, we're not going to offer up the mincha obviously on the Mizbeach. Nimtzu Eidim Zomamin. So it was actually an interesting case. Let's say witnesses come, right, to attest that she committed adultery. And those witnesses turn out to be Eidim Zomamin, which is fast. So what are Eidim Zomamin? Eidim Zomamin are witnesses that they're not necessarily lying. In other words, the event may have occurred. They're lying that they saw it, right? Remember, Eidim Zomamin are come along and say, we saw Rachel, commit adultery with Shimon. And meanwhile, another set of witnesses come along and say to those first set of witnesses, you could not have seen that. Why? Imano hayisem. You were with us. So let's say the witness becomes Zomamin, minchasa chulin. Ultimately, again, her mincha becomes chulin. I'm sorry. Right, minchasa chulin, her mincha becomes chulin. Eidim zomin ka'amrit, right? Eidim zomamin kala islahu. So we'll say Eidim zomin themselves have a kol. Ultimately, again, people know about Eidim zomamin, and therefore, again, if you look at Rashi says over Kala Islu, we'll say it is in the bottom part of Rashi, 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. Kala Islu, Hakol Yodin Shekdisha Taos. So we'll say in that case, everyone knows ultimately again that the entire Hekdish was Taos. Because remember again, I'm sorry, I left out one piece. The Gemara was talking about the concept of a concern that if something was already put in a klisharis, even if it turns out that it was a hekdish bitaos, the concern of just making it chulin, why? Because people may erroneously think that even when you properly consecrate something, technically speaking, the consecration could be dialed back. So we'll say the Gemara just says that concern doesn't apply over here. Why? Because everyone knows about Eidim Zomamin. Next, Tanya Kavas Rav Sheshes v'lo mitame. There's a brisa that supports Rav Sheshes. So once again, remember going back now. Rav Sheshes holds that halacha l'maisa. If there are Eidim anywhere that know about her guilt, ultimately, again, it will preclude the Sotah process from working. So there is a brisa that supports Rav Sheshes, but not according to the reasoning that he espoused. How so? So the Gemara says, Tahora, the pasuk says Tahora, v'lo sheyesh la edim b'medinas hem. So we'll say, when do the Sotah waters confer bracha upon a woman? Ultimately, if she's Tahora, but not if there are witnesses. In other words, if there are witnesses, so that'll prevent the water from working, but they won't confer bracha. Furthermore, again, I will say, when do the waters confer bracha? Only if she's truly tahora, not if she has some zechus that prevents the waters from adversely affecting her. Pasuk says he, and I will say, we're going to talk about this as well. There's a fascinating concept, namely that halacha l'maisa, if one goes ahead and has a situation where the immorality of the woman is so well known that everyone's talking about it, that also prevents the Sotah waters from working. Rabbi Shimon will say, so the point over here, what does this brisa highlight? This brisa highlights that apparently if there is a situation where halacha l'maisa, witnesses know about her infidelity, even if they're on the other side of the world, that will prevent the Sotah waters from working. So that backs up this assertion of Rav Sheshes. Rabbi Shimon will say, Nihi devav lo darish. Even though, again, he doesn't darish in the vav, v'ha'ika yesh la'idim dinas hayar, we'll say top of Zayin. Ultimately, again, we'll say, what does he do with this drasha that says about idim dinas hayam? He says, ultimately, again, lo shchicha. Ultimately, I will say that's so not common. So because it's not common, therefore people will not associate her innocence, so to speak, or actually not her innocence. People won't associate the failure of the waters to work with the fact that there are Eidim b'Medinas Hayam. Okay, and therefore, again, it won't cast dispersions ultimately on the water. So I will say, so that's the end of the sugya. So how do we pass? So I will say, again, it's one of these outstanding machloksim, where again, we'll see in the Rambam how the Rambam deals with this, but Lamaisa, just keep this in mind. This is going to be one of these running machloksim that we have in Sotah. That ultimately, again, halacha Lamaisa, if there are witnesses somewhere in the world that know about her guilt, her definitive guilt, does that prevent the waters from working or not? Fundamental machlokes, Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef. Okay, good. We'll say back to Mishnah, top of Zayin. Ketzad. So we'll say Ketzad Osala. So we'll say, so now let's play this out. We're continuing the process. Remember again, so far what do we have in the Sotah process? Part 1, Kinui, warning. Ruvain warns his wife Rachel, don't be alone with Shimon. Right? Let's just go with the halacha l'maisi. He warns her in front of 2 witnesses. That's part 1. Part 2, Rachel violates the warning and is alone with Shimon. Let's assume for our purposes right now that's called stira. That is called stira. And let's just assume right now that also occurs in the presence of 2 witnesses. So we'll say, so now what? What's the next stage? Here we go. Molicha lebezdin sheba osamakom. So the first thing he does is he brings her to the local bezdin. Ultimately, again, tells them what happened. The Eidim attests to what happened. And ultimately, again, they give Ruvain, the husband, 2 Talmidei Chachamim to accompany him and his wife to Yerushalayim. Because we'll say, as we're going to see, the entire Sotah process has to be done in the Beis HaMikdash itself. So he comes to the local Beis Din, tells them what happened. Local Beis Din gives him 2 Talmidei Chachamim to accompany him on the journey to Yerushalayim. Why? Shema Yavo Aleha Baderech. Ultimately, again, to prevent Ruvain from having relations with his wife on the way to Yerushalayim. Because what says we're going to see, there's a lav. It is prohibited for Ruvain, the husband, to have relations with his wife until this matter is resolved. So in order to ensure that that doesn't occur, he's accompanied by 2 Talmidei Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says, Baila ne'amar. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you don't need the Talmidei Chachamim. Ultimately, again, Ruvain is believed. Right? Ruvain is believed ultimately, again, to go ahead and not have relations with his wife. Good, says the Gemara. So, Trei v'iyu hatlasa. So, what says, here's what's interesting. So, remember again, you have Ruvain plus 2 Talmidei Chachamim. So, again, using our higher mathematical skills, right? What do we have? 3, right? So, we have 3 men and 1 woman. So, we'll say, what does this teach us? Let me say, Rav, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, because we'll say this comes to teach us or support another halacha. Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Rabbi Lo Shanu Ella Be'ir. Now I will say this is actually interesting. The concept of yichud, right? So yichud tells us, so the Gemara says that in Kiddushin we learned that ultimately again, one woman and two men does not create a yichud problem. There's no yichud. And I will say, when is that true? Be'ir, in the city. Aval b'derech, but I will say when you're in a more rural area, ad di'ika shlosha. Ultimately, there's no yichud problem. I should say differently. If you're in a rural area, you need 3 men and 1 woman. So in other words, in a rural area, you need more people in order to avoid a yichud situation. Why? Because what's the problem? If they're traveling in a more rural area and there's only 2 men and 1 woman, what could happen? One of the men can need to relieve himself. He's going to leave the group, right? And it turns out that because it's a rural area, 1 woman is secluded with 1 man. Therefore, in order to go ahead and address that concern in a rural area, you need 3 men and 1 woman. And I will say the Mishnah seems to support that. Why? Because remember again, when Reuven is traveling with Rachel up to Yerushalayim, what do we do? What does local Beis Din do? Assigns him 2 Talmidei Chachamim. This way there are always 3 men and 1 woman, avoiding the yichud problem. To which the Gemara says, no, that's actually not the issue. In fact, yichud again could always be obviated with 2 men and 1 woman. Hacha hainu taima ki echid lehavu aleh sahadi Talmidei Chachamim. Lehavi alei sahadi. Actually, the reason we want 2 over here is because 2 are witnesses. Meaning what? That if Reuven were to have relations with his wife Rachel, this way there would be 2 witnesses to that event, and therefore again they would prevent the Sotah process from progressing. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, Talmidei Chachamim in Kuli Amalo, if it's just about witnesses, why do they have to be Talmidei Chachamim? I will say anyone could be a witness, right? So just say the Beis Din assigns 2 guys to go up with Reuven and Rachel to Yerushalayim, and that's it. We're done. Why do they have to be Talmidei Chachamim? To which the Gemara says very interesting. Lima Misayele, Misayele Idach Rav the Amarav Yehuda Amarav Lo Shanu Elek Sherin. Furthermore, I will say again. Rav said, even in terms of yichud, I will say, when do we say that 2 men or even 3 men, whatever the number you need, is an appropriate number to avoid yichud? That's only with moral people. Aval prutzin, but I will say immoral people, afilu asara namilo. I will say if you have immoral people, no matter how large the group is, you'll still run into a yichud problem. Because the Gemara tells a story, Maisehaya, there was a story that occurred, Votziu asara b'mita. Ultimately, we'll listen to this, was a story the Gemara tells that one time there was an incredibly immoral group. Listen to this story. They pretended the woman died, that they were carrying out the body for burial, and meanwhile it turns out that Lamaisa, the group wanted to go to a more private area to all commit an immoral act together. And I will say, what's the point of that story? The point of that story is when you have immoral people, so numbers don't help avoid immorality when the entire group is dedicated to immorality. So I will say, so again, I don't understand. So why do I need 2 Talmidei Chachamim in this situation? Shabbos says actually very interesting. So it turns out that the Beis Din, the local Beis Din, assigns 2 Talmidei Chachamim to accompany Reuven and Rachel to the Beis Hamikdash, really for 2 reasons. Number 1, testimony. That in the event that Reuven does have relations with his wife Rachel, ultimately, again, there are people to attest to that, and they can prevent the Sotah process from moving forward. But we'll say there's another reason. What's the other reason? Ultimately, hasra. So remember again, before there is liability for any particular act. Now remember, there is liability if Reuven has relations with his wife Rachel before they go through the Sotah process. Now, the liability is a biblical prohibition, right? It's not an Isser Misa, it's not an Isser Kari, it's a biblical prohibition. But in order to be in violation of biblical prohibition, you need hasra, you need proper warning. I will say proper warning requires skill and knowledge. In other words, you have to know what you're warning about, you have to know the particular law, and you have to know the particular liability for that particular law. So that hasra itself requires a certain level of erudition. So because of that, the Beis Din assigns 2 Talmidei Chachamim to accompany Reuven and Rachel. So the two Talmidei serve this dual purpose. Number one, Eidos, testimony in the event that they have relations. And number two, I should say, number one, Hasra, proper warning should they have relations. And number two, testimony if they do in fact have relations. Incredible. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Baila. So Rabbi Yehuda says that Lamaisa, her husband is believed. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you don't have to dispatch. The Beis doesn't have to dispatch now two Talmidei Chachamim. So Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Baila Ne'ema Mikal V'chomer. Rabbi Yehuda says the husband is believed based on a Kal V'chomer. Rabbi says that's interesting. What's the Kal V'chomer? Umani Dashi Bekaris Baila Ne'eman Aleha. So we'll say, now watch this, right? Right? Every month one becomes a nida. Right? Then we'll say, now again, is a husband allowed to be alone with his wife who's a nida? The answer is yes. Right? There's no Isser Yichud, which is actually interesting. There's no Isser Yichud, ultimately again by a nida. So we say it like this: the punishment for relations with a nida is karis, and yet again the husband is believed. Right? You don't have to. There's no Isser Yichud. Sotah she belav la kol shekin. So we'll say Sotah, which is quote unquote only a lav. So the husband should certainly be believed. For the Rabbanan will say, no, it's not a good comparison. Here no senes. Neither the karis chamir le umehemen, Sotah the lav lo chamir le velo mehemen. The Rabbanan will say that's exactly the point. Sotah, which carries with it an Isser D'Oraisa, we trust the husband not to transgress. So Sotah, which is only, quote unquote, only a lav, that's where there is a concern that what? He will transgress. Rabbi Yehuda will say, Mikav v'chomer ma'isila. So we'll say, so does Rabbi Yehuda really bring it from a kav v'chomer? V'ha Rabbi Yehuda mikroi ma'isila. I thought Rabbi Yehuda brings it based on a pasuk. What's the pasuk? Disanya vehevi ha'ish es ishto ala kohen. So we'll listen to this. The pasuk says, the man will bring his wife to the kohen. Husband will bring his wife to the kohen. So Rabbi Yehuda says, Minat Torah ha'ish maybe es ishto. So ultimately, again, Minat Torah midoraisa, a husband just brings his wife himself. Right? There's no other accompaniment. Aval amru chachamim mosru lo shnei talmidei chachamim shema yavo aleh b'derech. But ultimately, again, Chazal said, you know what? Let's assign two talmidei chachamim to ultimately go with Reuven and Rachel, in order that Reuven doesn't end up having relations with Rachel on the way. So Rabbi Yossi says, Baila ne'eman aleh mikal v'chomer. Rabbi Yossi says, no, the husband is believed based on a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Umani dashi bekares Baila ne'eman aleha. So I'll say ultimately nida, which is an Isser Kares. Husband is believed to be alone with her and not transgress. Sotah shiva lav lo kol shekin. Sotah, which is quote unquote only a lav, certainly they should be permitted to be alone. Amru lo, im armet benida shekin yesh la heter. Tomar besota she'ein lo heter. So Rabbi say this is fascinating. In this version, Rabbi say in this brisa, so the svara is a little bit different. By nida, why is a husband permitted to be alone with his wife and we're not afraid of transgression? Why, Rabbi say? Because we know she's going to become permitted. Right? Rabbi say, so remember, a man knows his wife is going to go to the mikvah, and ultimately she's going to be permitted. So Rabbi say, so what we call that in halacha, pas besala. Right, there's bread in the basket, right? Bread in the basket. So we know she's going to become permitted. So because she's going to become permitted, again, he could abstain, refrain, and hold himself back. I will say, here's what's interesting. Sotah, tomar b'sotah, she'in laheter. Now I will say, sotah, ultimately, again, if she is found to be tameya, so that's it. Right, their relationship is over. So maybe that's where the Yetzer Hara is a bit stronger, and we're afraid that he's going to transgress. Va'omer mayim genuvim yimtaku. And I will say, what do people say? Like the pasuk says, right? Stolen waters, right? Stolen waters are always sweeter, right? The forbidden fruit is always sweeter. Rabbi Yehuda, so we'll say, so that's the machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Min HaTorah ha'ish mevies ishto ala kohen, shenemar v'hevia ish es ishto. So we'll say, listen to this. So you see over here that Rabbi Yehuda is not basing on a kal v'chomer, but rather he's basing on the pasuk. Right? Rabbi Yehuda says just mid da'oraisa. The pasuk itself says the husband will bring his wife to the kohen, which indicates to us that a husband is believed to bring his wife on his own without any accompaniment. Yet we said before that what? That it was based on a kal v'chomer, to which the Gemara says, Amar lahu kal v'chomer bereisha, uparchua, v'amar lahu kra. So we'll say, listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda said, originally, I thought that the argument ultimately, again, to allow a husband to bring his wife by himself was based on the Kal V'chomer. We'll say, what was the Kal V'chomer? The original Kal V'chomer was that if a man is believed to be alone with his wife who's in Nida, and we're not afraid they're going to transgress, he should be believed to go ahead and bring his wife who's a Sotah, and they're not going to transgress. To which the Gemara says, to which the Pircha, to which the way we refuted the Kal V'chomer was, but 1 second, Nida is an Isser Kares. Sotah is an Isser Lav. It's an Isser Kares that we trust him to keep it together and not transgress, but maybe with a Lav he will transgress. Rabbi Yehuda saw once his Kal V'chomer was refuted, so he decided to prove this point from the pasuk. Right? Well, vehevi ha'ish es ishta. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. See, normally you would think that ultimately, again, you would start with the pasuk. Here in this version, Rabbi Yehuda started with the Kal V'chomer. Once the Kal V'chomer was refuted, then he went to the pasuk. Okay. To which the Gemara says, "I Rabbi Yehuda hainu tanakama." But I will say ultimately again. But it sounds like Rabbi Yehuda is saying the same thing as the Tanakama, because also remember again, if you read the Brisa, the way the Brisa says is, mid the Oraisa, a husband is permitted to go ahead and bring his wife himself, aval amru, but Chazal said, you know what, better to go ahead and not be alone. And therefore, again, the local basin would assign 2 people. And I will say, it sounds like Rabbi Yehuda is subscribing to this idea as well, to which the Gemara says, if that's the case, Rabbi Yehuda and Tanakama are saying the same thing, to which the Gemara says, Ika benaihu aval amru. The Rabbi say the fundamental distinction is aval amru. In other words, Rabbi say that Rabbi Yehuda does not subscribe to the idea of 2 Talmidei Chachamim accompanying them. So Rabbi say, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, there is a fundamental machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama. So we'll say Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, husband has the ability to transport to go with his wife himself, just the 2 of them, to the Beis HaMikdash, and we are not concerned that anything is going to happen. Tanakama holds, no, they can't go alone. Local Beis Din assigns 2 Talmidei Chachamim to go ahead and go with them. We'll say, why 2 Talmidei Chachamim? Number one, Hasra. Number 2, Eidos. We'll say, how do we paskin? The Rambam paskins like the Tanakama, and in fact, husband and wife would not go alone to the Beis HaMikdash. Rather, again, the local Beis Din would assign 2 Talmidei Chachamim to accompany them on their journey. Incredible. We'll say, Mishnah. So we'll say, now the next stage of the process. They've reached Yerushalayim. I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, what a schus to read these words on Erev Pesach. I will say, leave aside the context for just a moment. Right? Where was everyone at Erev Pesach? Where was everyone at Pesach? Everyone was in the Beis HaMikdash. Right, to say again, they're in Yerushalayim. So what was happening Erev Pesach? You're shechting your carbon Pesach. You're getting ready for the Yom Tiv. So I just want to point out how incredible is it that on Erev Pesach, Hayu Ma'alin Osa, the Beis Din Hagadol Yerushalayim. Remember again, where was the Beis Din Hagadol? Where was that? This is the Sanhedrin. Where was the High Court? In the Lishkas Hagos, the chamber of hewn stone, which is one of the chambers in the Beis HaMikdash. So I will say, so remember again, this is literally again, we're reading this phrase, Hayumalin Osa, the Beis Din Hagadol Shebiyushalayim. So he would bring her up to the Sanhedrin. Again, I will say different context, but it's supposed to read these words on Erev Pesach. Uma'aymin Allah, Keder Shema'aymin al Eidi Nefashas. So I will say, listen to this. And I will say, we're going to see something very interesting. Ma'aymin Allah means they would let's say it literally means like intimidate her. They would intimidate her in the same way that they would intimidate witnesses who came to testify about a capital crime. I was going to say, if witnesses showed up to testify about a capital crime, right, that Reuven killed Shimon, they would intimidate the witnesses. I was saying, so it sounds terrible. What does it mean? It's probably a better word, but right, intimidation over here means that we want her to understand the severity of what it is that's happening here. And I'm going to say, essentially, we have one simple goal. What's the simple goal? If she is guilty, just admit it. Just admit it. In other words, so much better to admit the guilt. Remember, if she admits the guilt, what happens? What happens if she admits? We're going to see. What if she admits the guilt? There's no death penalty, right? She gets divorced. It's true she doesn't get her ksuva, but she has the ability to remarry. She has the ability to rebuild her life, and that's it. Masha'en Kain, if she's lying about her innocence and she drinks the water, it's the end of the road. So that means we try to, quote unquote, like intimidate her, that if she is lying, just admit it. Just admit it. And we say to her, Biti, harbe yayin osa. Sometimes too much wine makes people do bad things. Harbe schok osa. Too much levity makes people do bad things. Harbe yaldus osa. Too much immaturity makes people do crazy things. Harbe shchenim rhinosin. Sometimes bad neighbors, bad influences makes people do things. Ultimately, we say to her, listen, if you're guilty, admit it. Don't have the name of Hashem erased in the Sotah waters unnecessarily. If you are guilty, in other words, we'll say, this is incredible. What they tell her in the Beis HaMikdash was, people make mistakes. People make mistakes. Sometimes people drink too much wine and they make mistakes. People have the wrong friends and they make mistakes. People are immature and people make mistakes. But I will say, here's incredible. It's part of Musar. What's the key in life when you make mistakes? So I will say, what's the key in life? What's the key? Own it. Own it. Then move on, right? First step is you got to own it, right? You have to own it. After you own it, you could say, my da hava hava. Went back to yesterday's daf, right? But Lamaisa, just got to own it. So the first thing we kind of tell them when we get here, and I will say, that's why I'm saying the word intimidation sounds like very coarse and rough. It's actually just the opposite. This is kind and sweet. This is telling her, we all make mistakes in life. So perhaps you have made a dramatic mistake. But if so we'll say, see, here's what happens. It's incredible psychology of mistakes. Often, what do we do when we make mistakes in life? What do? Right? We double down. We double down. Oh, no, I didn't do anything wrong, right? And we start explaining, we start this, we start that. So the worst thing you could do when you make a mistake is to double down. The best thing you could do with a mistake is just own it. Again, what are they telling her? We'll say, I just want to point out, if she is guilty, this is a pretty severe transgression. It is fascinating, however, how the Sanhedrin deals with it. And essentially, we'll say what they do with it is not minimize the Avera, but minimize the dynamic of sin. We all make mistakes in life. We all make mistakes. Just own it. Just own it. You'll move on. We'll all move on, and things will be fine. But the worst thing you could do is double down on this. Incredible. Asil Shma. Good. So the Gemara says, "Va'omer the final divrei she'enim kedai l'shoman he v'chol mishpachas beis avia." And I will say, we say in front of her things that ultimately, again, shouldn't really be said. And I will say, we'll define this in the Gemara, but the way Rashi explains it over here is we tell her multiple stories of righteous people who owned their mistakes. Right? Tanakh is filled with stories of people who made mistakes, owned their mistakes, and then moved on in life. So we'll say, if as a result of all of this, she says, you know what, you're right, I committed adultery, then Shavars Ksuva Saviyoses. Ultimately, what happens? Shavars Ksuva means she doesn't get her Ksuva. Right? Literally, again, we break her Ksuva or give her a receipt for her Ksuva. So she doesn't get her Ksuva, and she gets divorced. That's it. She gets a get, no Ksuva, moves on with her life. Amra Tahorani. I'll say, but if she says, I am Tahora, if she insists on being innocent, if she insists on her innocence, then what do? Ma'alin osel shar hamizrach, shal pesach, shar nikanor. So I'll say, so what do? We bring her to the eastern gate, which is by Nikanor. Now, both remember again, Shar Nikanor is the primary entrance between the Azara, what we'll call the Ezras Nashim, right, or the general courtyard, right, and ultimately again into the primary courtyard where the Mizbeach was. That's Shar Nikanor. So we bring her to Shar Nikanor. Shapes, right? Shesham mashkines hasotos. That's where we have the sotah drink. Umatarnas hayoldos, and we purify women who have given birth. Umatarnas mitzorah, and ultimately, again, we provide tara to the mitzorah as well. The Shabbos says, now what's the process? The kohen oches bebigda. The kohen takes hold of her clothing. So we'll say, so now we're into the sotah process. So the kohen takes hold of her clothing. We'll say, really, he's taking hold by the neckline of her clothing, and he pulls it. Im nikru. Nifru niframu. If it's torn, it's torn. If it gets shredded, it's shredded. Ad shehe megala es liba. Ultimately, again, until he reveals her heart. And I will say, we're going to define what this means in an idea. The idea is to tear. I will say, you know what it's like? You know what it's almost like? It's almost reminiscent of what? Of kriya by mourning, right? The Rebbe says, same halacha by kriya, by mourning, ultimately is you take by the neckline and you rip. So the Kohen takes hold of her clothing and pulls it. The idea is a kriya over here. And I will say the concept of a kriya is, so I will say, sometimes in life, even if you haven't done anything wrong, allowing yourself to be in certain situations is a failure in and of itself. Because let's point out something very important over here, right? The only way a woman is getting into this scenario, right? How sometimes, see, you ever have a situation where you ask yourself, how did I get here? Right? How did I get here? So let's take a step back. How did Rachel get here? Right? What's the answer? How did Rachel get here? How did Rachel get here? Number one, she was engaging in behavior that required her husband to warn her not to be alone with a certain man. So that in and of itself, I will say, right? Why? Like, what? How are you getting there? That's stage one. What's stage two? She violated the warning. She was alone with that very same man for long enough for something to have occurred. So I will say, so let's be clear. Is it possible that Rachel did not commit adultery? Is it possible? Absolutely. After all, she herself is proclaiming her innocence. But I will say, sometimes in life, you could be innocent from the commission of a particular act, of an aveira, but you're still wrong for allowing yourself to fall into a certain situation. So I want to be clear over here. Could be, because you look at this, I will say, and the truth is, this whole thing is very debasing. It is. Sotah is a very debasing situation for the woman. It absolutely is. And we'll say, what happens, like, if she's innocent, you've debased an innocent woman. And the whole point over here is, she may be innocent of adultery. She's not innocent of making bad life choices. And the whole point of this, I will say, this is a very public process that is aimed, it sounds strange, that is aimed to degrade in order that it should serve as a public service announcement. Don't allow yourself to get into questionable situations. Even if you haven't sinned, I will say life is not about sinning. I will say, what is life about? Life is about being Rosh Hanola. The whole chap of life. I will say, very often, if you allow yourself to get into the situation where you're choosing between sinning and not sinning, more often than not, what's going to happen? You're going to sin. The whole chap in life is to prevent myself from getting into bad situations to begin with. That's the whole chap. Don't even be in a situation of sin. Be proactive in the way that you live and prevent yourself from even getting into the bad situations to begin with. So what happens? So they tear her clothing. For Sotah Sarah, they uncover her hair. Rabbi Huda says, Im haya liba noah, lo haya megaleu. Im haya Sarah noah, lo haya. So Rabbi Huda says, if she's a very attractive woman, so we don't tear her clothing all the way down, right, to her chest. Also, we're going to see, it doesn't literally mean that she's standing there unclothed. The point over is we wouldn't tear her clothing in a dramatic way, nor do we uncover her hair, because obviously it's a public situation. If she's very attractive, right, we don't want creating, arousal for the people who are around there also. We'll say, it must be an interesting job for the guy to determine who's attractive, who's not attractive. I don't know who gets that job, right? But Lamaisa, again, you see, it depends on the person. Ultimately, again, if she was clothed with white clothing, we would reclothe her with dark clothing. Hayalek lizav amud beis uvekat lios nizam vetabos ma'avira mimena kedei lenavla. Both say if she's wearing jewelry, we remove her jewelry in order that she should not look as beautiful. So I'll say the idea over here is that we don't want her to look. The whole point over here, I'll say again, as I mentioned before, is a debasing. That is the entire chap over here. We don't want her to look attractive ultimately again in this process. And therefore, again, if there's jewelry, nice clothing, we remove all of that. So the Gemara says, V'achar kach mevi chevel mitzri, v'kosh l'ma'al midadeha. So say after that, they bring a rope and they tie it on her chest, because again, I will say, since her dress is ripped, they don't want her dress falling down. So they keep the rope there to keep the dress up. Whoever wants to come and see this process can come and see this process. chutz me'avadah v'shiv choseha, with the exception of Rachel's servants. Why? So the Gemara says, Mipnei shalibo gaspain. Rabbi said it's incredible, because what are we concerned about? If Rachel's servants are there, so Rachel's the mistress, right? Rachel's the master, right? So we're afraid that if her servants are there, she's going to be too embarrassed to admit her guilt in the presence of her servants, and she may protest to her innocence, even though she's not really innocent. V'chol nashim mutaros lirosa, and all the women could come and see. Shneimar v'nosru kol hanashim v'lo tasena kizim. The lashon is kizimas chena. Good. So the idea is that this is a public spectacle. This whole thing is a public spectacle. And I will say the idea about, just to understand the idea behind it, why so public? Especially, I will say, given the fact that she may be innocent. So why so public if in fact she may be innocent? And I will say because she may be innocent of adultery. She's not innocent of bad life decisions. And I will say part of the whole chap of this process is to sensitize us to avoiding bad life decisions. 95% of success in life is not about choosing between right and wrong. It's preventing yourself from ever getting into that situation where you have to choose between right and wrong. And I will say, that's the whole chap of Sotah. Sotah's allowing oneself to be in a bad situation. When you put yourself in bad situations, bad stuff occurs. That's the sensitivity that's being created. It's really incredible. Says the Gemara. So I will say, from where do we know this, right? So first of all, let's go back for just a moment. Remember, what's happening over here? This entire process is happening in front of the Sanhedrin. So first of all, why do you need a Sanhedrin? Why do you need a Sanhedrin? To which the Gemara says, Amrav Chia bar Gamda Amrav Yossi bar Bechanina Asya Torah Torah Gzer Shavah Torah Torah Ksiv Hacha Va'asala Koin is called Torah Uksiv Hasam Al Pia Torah She'erucha Ma'alahalon B'Shivim Ve'echad Avkam B'Shivim Ve'echad. So again, Gzer Shavah Torah Torah over there means the basin of 71, i.e. Sanhedrin HaGadol. So too over here by Sotah, you need Sanhedrin HaGadol. Incredible. Umma Aymin Aleha, and I will say we intimidate her. We intimidate her. In other words, but again, I want to point out, it's positive intimidation, right? The positive intimidation. So that's why really, the truth is, I'm not going to use the word intimidation. Prevail. We prevail upon her, right? We prevail upon her. All the world says, so what does it mean? We try to tell her, remember, the first stage is we tell her, people make mistakes. People make mistakes. Don't double down. You have a chance to recover. You have a chance to rebound. Own it, and then you'll be able to move on. So the Gemara says, Rabbi said the same way that we prevail upon her not to drink, if she is resolute in drinking, we prevail upon her to drink. To drink. And what do we say to her? Omer lo, biti, im baralach, hadavar shetahora'at, if you know for sure that you are tahora, that you did not commit adultery, imdi al bariech v'shasi. So okay, stand your ground, and drink. Because these waters are like a balm, like a salve, like an ointment on flesh that is totally fine, healthy flesh. If there's an open wound, then ultimately the ointment seeps in. Ultimately, again, but if halacha l'maisa, there is no wound, then the ointment does nothing. So they say the same thing. The waters only impact and hurt someone if halacha l'maisa, the person is guilty. But if there's no guilt, then it's like Rabbi. So both say, so a contradiction. Our Mishnah seems to indicate that we only prevail upon her not to drink. Our Mishnah makes no mention of prevailing upon her to drink. So which one is it? To which the one is the lo kasha. Kan kodim shenim chaka megillah, kan la'achar shenucha megillah. Well, it's incredible, and we'll see this more explicitly later on. What does it depend on? It depends on if the parchment has been erased. So I will say if halacha l'maisa, the parchment has already been erased, then what? Let me take a step back. If the parchment has not yet been erased, that's when we prevail or even intimidate, positive intimidation, not to drink. If halacha l'maisa, again, the parchment has already been erased, then what I will say? Then we prevail, positive intimidation, to drink. Va'omer lefanav. So I'll say, so again, remember, we give her chizuk. We give her, what kind of chizuk do we give her? We tell her about people who made mistakes, admitted and owned their mistakes, and then went on to lead positive and productive lives. Tan Rabbanan. Omer lefanav dvarim shel hagad u'maisim shir b'ksum harishonim. Kigon. Asher chachamim yagidu v'lo kichudom elasam. So we give her examples. We'll say, Yehuda hoda v'lo bosh. Ultimately, again, Yehuda admitted his transgression, and he was not embarrassed. Right? The Gemara says, "Sofo nachol chay olam haba." And we'll say, what ended up happening? He got olam haba. Olam haba. Similarly, again, Ruvain hoda v'lo bosh. Ruvain admitted his mistake, was not embarrassed. Mahaya sofra. We'll say, what did he get? Nachol chaye ha'olam haba. He inherited the world to come. Umaschar. And we'll say, what was Yehuda and Ruvain's reward for admitting their transgression? We just said, what do you mean maschar? We just said what their reward was. Kidikaminon. We just said they got olam haba. Elamascharan ba'olam hazeh. So ultimately, we'll say, what was their reward in this world? In other words, I understand they got olam haba for admitting and owning their mistake. What was their reward for the world to come? To which the Gemara says, Lahem levadam nasna aretz v'lo avar zar b'socham. Literally translated, HaKadosh Baruch Hu only gave them the land, and no other stranger passed amongst them. So we'll say, ultimately, again, Yehuda's reward, Rashi explains, Yehuda's reward was that he got malchus, monarchy. Ruvain's reward, we'll say, interestingly, Ruvain was the first tribe to be allotted his portion in Eretz Yisrael. That was so their reward in the world to come was Olam Haba. Their reward in this world ultimately again was Yehuda got monarchy. Ruvain ultimately again received his tribal portion first. So Bishlam Yehuda Ashkichan Deudi Dichsev Vayak Yehuda Vayamsad Kamimeni. So we'll say, so again, I know the story of Yehuda admitting his liability, right? So we'll say, what's the story of Yehuda? That's the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Remember again, I will say very quickly, Yehuda has 3 sons. They're married to Tamar. The first 2 married Tamar and died. Now the reason they died was because they wasted their zera. Right, they wasted their seed, but Lamaisa, now Yehuda doesn't know that. He thinks it's Tamar, he thinks like Tamar's like the black widow. Right? So he does not want to marry her off to his 3rd son, Shelah. We know the story. Tamar dresses up as a Zona, becomes pregnant from Yehuda. She's about to be executed because they think that she committed a biblical form of adultery. So Lamaisa, again, she says, no, the person, right? And remember, Yehuda had given her his staff and his ring, ultimately as payment. She says, the person who is the owner of the staff and ring is the father of my child. Yehuda could have remained silent in order to avoid any type of embarrassment, but he doesn't. He says ultimately tzadka men. So this is where Yehuda admitted his act. So I know Yehuda. Ela Ruvain minal andu. They both say, but where do you see Ruvain? Where do you see Ruvain admitting a transgression? So let's listen to this. Incredible. What's the meaning, I will say, of the phrase where it says, Yechi Ruvain va'al yamos. Ruvain should live and he shouldn't die. Vizos li Yehuda. So kol osan shanim shahayu yisrael b'midbar. But I'll say all the years that Klal Yisrael was in the Midbar. So we'll say, remember again, a bit of context. The Torah itself tells us explicitly that when Klal Yisrael, we'll say, by the way, isn't this incredible? Another Mitzrayim reference. When Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim, they took the remains of Yosef with them. Chazal tells us that not only did they take the remains of Yosef, but they took the remains of all of the Shvatim with them as well. We'll stop over here for today. And we're going to pick up with this story, Meretz Hashem, tomorrow. Again, so let's see, where we're ending off is that we now know the story of Yehuda, where Yehuda took responsibility for that which he had done wrong. In this next step, Rabbi said, we're going to see where do we see that by Ruvain? Where do we see it by Ruvain? And ultimately, again, these stories serve as a sense of chizuk. Ultimately, again, for the suspected Sotah, Rabbi, incredible shkayach. All right, Chevron Zoom, Reb Jerry Chakasha v'sameach, Dr. Lossman Chakasha v'sameach, Jeremy Chakasha v'sameach. I think everyone else I'm going to see over Yontif in Meretz Hashem. Right, Kamal Akiva, Meretz Hashem, Larry, Michael, Chaim. Again, Chakasha v'sameach, everyone. Shkoyach. Oh, Ramel, Shalom Aleichem. Wait 1 second, I'm just stopping this.